The Promise. I am in my late 40s and a widower. Currently, I reside in Minnesota. These events happened when I was much younger and not as wise as I am now. When my family first moved to Arkansas, we did a hooplee or spirit call, usually performed as a celebratory event. The Hmong community was small, so the majority of them came to join. I met some of the local guys around my age, and that was how I became friends with Lou. They moved to Thailand 5 years prior to our meeting. They also raised chickens like us, but on his aunt's property. We became good friends and were like brothers. We traveled to Hmong tournaments and New Year's together. Asian Town was a popular website at the time. We met Hmong girls around Arkansas and Missouri through it. In Asian Town, I met a girl that I really liked. Her name was Belle. We messaged one another and talked a few times over the phone. We avoided seeing each other in person until the Hmong New Year. In October of 2001, Lou and I went to the local Hmong New Year's festival. After 2 months of talking to Belle, I was excited to finally see her for the first time. She was standing by the food court, waiting for me alongside her girl cousins. Belle had on Hmong clothes. She was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I immediately fell in love. We talked for a while. Then, for some reason, she began to act like she wasn't into me anymore. She distanced herself and didn't want to hang around me, shielding herself with her cousins. About mid-afternoon, Belle looked at her watch, then told me her family was expecting relatives to be visiting, so she needed to go home and cook. I was disappointed, so I told her I will be going home also. It was strange because when we talked for those 2 months, everything was great. Frustrated, Lou and I made our way to the car. I couldn't keep her out of my mind, even after what happened at the festival. I tried calling Belle, but she didn't answer nor message me back on Asian Town. I talked to Lou about her all the time, and told him how much I miss her and want her. I even went as far as asking my dad to do the traditional Hmong marriage and talk to her parents, but he refused. My obsession began to consume my thinking and rationality. One day I got really frustrated and asked Lou if there was a way to get Belle as a wife. Lou said there was a way, but he doesn't recommend it. He looked like he did not want to tell me. Lou suggested I get with someone else instead. I begged and cried to the point where Lou didn't know what else to do, so he told me. He said back in Thailand he saw a shaman do a ritual that helped a couple get pregnant. He explained the process and warned me not to do it. Despite his warning, I went behind one of the empty chicken houses around 3 a.m. that night. I took along with me a bowl of uncooked rice, some incense, joss paper, and 2 boiled eggs. I placed these items on the wooden ledge, lit up the incense, and stuck them in the rice. I took a picture of Belle and I, the one we took at the festival, and placed it in between the incense and eggs. I asked and begged the spirit of the earth, the land, my ancestors, and anyone else to heed my prayer. I prayed to them that in 30 days, if Belle becomes my wife, I will sacrifice to them the strongest and most beautiful cow. I burnt the joss paper and bowed. When I stood up, I felt a sudden breeze blow by me. 2 days later, Belle called me and apologized for her delayed response and what happened at the festival. We talked that night, and I went to visit her the next morning. I picked her up, and we spent the day together. When I was about to take her home, I decided to bring her home as my wife instead. I merged off the highway toward my house. I asked if she was okay with it, and she smiled and said yes, it was okay, she doesn't mind. We ended up getting married. 30 days have gone by, and I haven't made the sacrifice for the promise I've made. Nothing happened. I got the girl of my dreams, and we loved each other very much. For once, I was happy and content. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night to cats scratching and crying from outside the walls of our bedroom. I woke Belle up and asked if she heard it, to which she replied she didn't hear a thing. I went outside to look. I shined the flashlight around, but didn't see anything. Just my dogs whimpering in their cages, and some lights flickering in the distance. Maybe the cats ran away. Still looking around, I felt a cold chill. My arms had goosebumps all over. My ears felt heavy like something was there. I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I jumped. It was Belle. She told me to come back to bed. I laid in bed trying to sleep, tossing and turning, but the cats kept scraping the walls and crying. It began to sound more and more like infants crying down the hallway. In the morning, I heard my mom and dad arguing. I asked what was wrong, and my dad said all 40,000 chickens in one of the houses were dead. It looked like some animal came and tore them apart, and blood was everywhere. After helping my parents clean up, I went to nap in the bedroom. I began falling asleep, but I heard soft footsteps around the room. I squinted my eyes and saw a figure with long dark hair standing with its back facing me, just rocking back and forth. I thought it was Belle because she had a similar build, so I ignored it and rolled onto my back and fell asleep. Then I heard a noise similar to a Hmong funeral drum thumping and money coins jangling around. Suddenly, something jumped on me and pressed down on my chest. I quickly opened my eyes, realizing it wasn't a dream, but I was powerless and paralyzed. I screamed, but nothing came out. Money coins jingled loud and the drum beats echoed. Then a black shadow-like figure with no face pressed its fingers on my chest as its long hair brushed against my face. It stuck its long pale blue tongue out and licked at my face. I shuddered at the cold, slimy touch. Then I heard the door open and the faceless demon vanished. Belle walked in and woke me for dinner. I was so relieved to hear her voice. The next day, I didn't feel well at all, but I had to help Belle harvest vegetables before the frost killed them. I hiked up the hill to where the garden was. Belle was already hard at work, and beside her were my dogs. They were all barking at me, but whimpered and ran away as I got closer. Belle told me to go back home because I looked sick, but I refused. There was a bamboo basket laying on the ground where Belle was. I strapped it onto my back and asked why it was so heavy. Belle turned around to look at me, and she screamed. She stumbled backwards, falling on her butt. Eyes wide, my wife pointed at me, mumbling something incoherent. I turned around, but didn't see anything. I ran over to Belle, and she quickly removed the basket and threw it away. She grabbed my hand, and we ran away. I asked what was wrong. She replied, there was a little girl in old dirty Hmong clothes sitting in the bamboo basket and smiling at her. Later that night, while everyone was sitting around watching TV in the living room, Belle told my parents about what happened. They said it was probably nothing and not to worry about it. However, the hauntings continued as time passed. It was December, and I was outside with Lou, sitting on the steps of our porch. My health had declined greatly. Everywhere I go, it smelled of rot. It was cold all the time, and I could barely move in my weakened state. I'd lost a ton of weight due to not being able to eat much. My skin had blisters all over and looked like it was decaying. Belle and I's relationship had become extremely rocky. We spent what little time we had together arguing. As cold as it was being outside, it was the only place that doesn't smell like death and decay. It was where I could get some peace and quiet. So are you going to fulfill that promise? It's well past 30 days and I haven't heard a word from you, Lou asked. No, why should I? I'm sick and miserable and my marriage is falling apart, I exclaimed. Aren't you afraid to lose what is precious to you? Lou asked with worried eyes. I shook my head in frustration. We talked for a while. Then I heard the door open. Belle came out, yelling at me for being outside. She told me to go back in because it was cold. You see, Lou, this is what I mean. I'm supposed to be happy, but I'm sick and miserable. That's why I'm not doing the offering, I said. Who are you talking to? Are you crazy? There isn't anyone here besides you and me, shouted Belle. A funeral drum began beating from out of nowhere with the blare of a king song. I turned to look at Lou. His eyes were dark black like the night sky. He sat there smiling at me, then reached over and grabbed Belle's hand, yanking her toward him. I woke up in a cold sweat, kicking and screaming. I sat up, panting heavily, and glanced over at my wife, relieved she was still next to me, sound asleep. Later that day, I finally told my parents and Belle about what I did, saying Lou gave me instructions to perform the ritual. My parents scolded me for going through such a heinous act. They added they've never seen nor heard of anyone named Lou. Belle claimed neither she or any of her cousins saw another person with me at the New Year's festival. Everyone was beyond upset at me. Belle cried and ran off to her parents. My parents said she had every right to be upset because they were just as disappointed in me. They said to give her time to cool off, and she would return whenever she was ready. If not, we could go get her back, but no matter what, I'd have to fulfill the promise made during the ritual. I tried calling Belle all day after that, but she didn't answer my calls or text messages. I then called her parents later that evening, asking to speak with her. Belle's parents told me she just left her house after they spoke with her, telling her to go back to me. It was about an hour-and-a-half drive from their house to ours, so I waited for Belle to return and eventually dozed off in the living room. I heard the door unlock, then the chain rattled, preventing the door from opening all the way. Ku, oh Ku, open the door, Belle called out in Hmong as she pressed her face against the small opening. I got up from the couch and hadn't even made it to the door when my phone buzzed. It was my mother-in-law. Ku, oh Ku, open the door for me, Belle called out again. I rejected the call as I made my way over to the door. I undid the chain and opened it. Belle and I embraced. I'm so sorry, I was stupid. Didn't know if you were ever coming back to me again, I sobbed. I promise I'll make things right this time. My phone was buzzing like crazy. It was my mother-in-law again. I answered. She was crying and sobbing hysterically. I could hardly understand what was being said. The only words I could make out were police, accident, and Belle's gone. All your fault. My eyes widened and my heart sank. A chill ran up my spine with goosebumps rippling throughout my body, and a huge knot formed in my throat. That's impossible. She's right here, I barely managed to say before involuntarily dropping the phone onto the floor. I shoved who or whatever it was in front of me to create some distance between us. That was when I saw the horrifying figure in its true form. It was indeed Belle. Her neck was bent and awkwardly hung to one side of her shoulders. There was blood spattered all over her face and blouse. Her eyes were sunken with only the whites of them showing. Her skin was a pale grayish-blue color. Her once long shiny black hair was a bloody tangled mess. I gasped and stumbled backwards. My legs tripped over one another and I fell onto my rear. I crawled backwards, but she pursued me, with her pale arms outstretched, twitching and convulsing with every step she took. Ku, oh Ku, you promised, she said. No, get away from me, I cried, still hopelessly backing away from her. She was only mere inches from me. My whole family must have heard the commotion and rushed over to the living room. Help me! Help me, please! She's a demon! I shouted. My dad began yelling and chanting some shamanic incantations. There was a clap of thunder, and Belle disappeared before our very eyes. After burying my wife, we continued to have horrific paranormal experiences. Some of my dogs went missing. Sometimes I saw pools of blood trails with dog hairs, but no body. Massive chickens in the houses were turned up dead. When inspecting them, it seemed like their heads were ripped apart by teeth marks and their bodies torn. I consistently suffered from sleep paralysis and terrifying nightmares. I often see her briefly creeping around the living room and sometimes sitting in the bed, smiling and taunting me. My family eventually had a shaman perform a ritual, sacrificing the largest and most beautiful cow we were able to find. After that, everything went back to normal. We ended up selling the farm and moving away. I wished I would have done the sacrifice like I've promised earlier. Maybe things would have been different.